So I released a video about a month ago where I complained about there being 4 different casters in 5th edition that use charisma, and how I thought about half of them didn't really make sense. After that video went up, multiple people had really good counterpoints, and completely flipped my view on the topic. Before I go into that, let me first explain the topic so the rest of this video makes sense. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, all spellcasters associate a stat with their spellcasting, and it's always one of their mental stats. While the stat has some mechanical uses, it doesn't actually change whether a caster uses wisdom, intelligence, or charisma to cast, it's all just flavour. For example, bards who use charisma is stated that they interact with magic by pouring their heart and soul into your performance with your music or oration. Now, I'm not going to explain why every single class uses their specific spellcasting modifier, especially since most are pretty self-explanatory. Wizards are studious and use intelligence. Clerics are devout and use wisdom. Now, what my original video was about was that 4 separate classes use charisma for spellcasting. Only 2 use intelligence, one of which was only recently introduced, and 3 use wisdom. And also that I thought sorcerer in particular didn't really make any sense to use charisma to cast, since their spellcasting comes from their bloodlines. I felt that wisdom or constitution probably would have fit them better. After uploading the video and reading some comments, I realised there's 2 main reasons why sorcerers use charisma for their spellcasting modifier. The first reason has a lot to do with history of charisma in Dungeons & Dragons, and the second reason is that it actually does make sense, I just wasn't being very open-minded about it. Okay, so firstly we need to remember that the rules for stats, classes and spellcasting have massively changed over the course of the last 30 years, so we need to go back and look at how older editions use charisma and spellcasting. Charisma in 1st edition is specifically stated to not control your ability to convince people, and rather simply the player's role-playing ability and choice of words affect it mostly. As for spellcasting, your ability scores don't really affect your rolls at all, instead there's a table you follow depending on what level you are. However, you do get bonus spells depending on your ability scores, and you need to have a minimum ability score to play certain classes. The only classes that have a minimum ability score of charisma above 6 are Druid and Paladin. Paladin of which requires 17 for some reason, even though they don't really use it at all in this edition. From what I understand of 1st edition, your ability scores don't really mean anything, they just matter whether or not you're allowed to play the class with your scores. So if charisma barely affects your ability to convince people, doesn't affect your spellcasting, and isn't used at all by classes that require it, what does it even do in this edition? Well, it lets you have additional henchmen, which is a strange rule that exists in older editions of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as affecting the loyalty of your said henchmen. Second edition is very similar to first, but it's a lot nicer to read and cleaned up. Charisma's description, while still stating it doesn't really affect your overall attractiveness, now no longer includes a statement that it doesn't control negotiations. The henchman rule still exists and is mostly the same. What is new, however, is the Bard class, which surprising to me in this edition was originally a member of the Thief class group. Bards here don't use charisma for casting, and simply gained extra spells depending on their ability score, which is pretty usual for casters in this edition. What's especially interesting though, is Bards, which in modern D&D are known as the charisma class, have a lower charisma requirement than Paladins in 2nd edition, and the same requirement as Druids. 3rd edition has a massive rework of most of the D&D systems. It's very similar to 5th edition, but is a bit more clunky. This edition has a long descriptor of the charisma skill that has now changed to mention that charisma does affect the character's physical attractiveness. The henchman system's now gone, but charisma's stats is way more useful since it's a bunch of skills in the new skill system that are associated with it, like bluff, diplomacy, and intimidate. In this edition, the sorcerer class is finally introduced. While there's no bloodline mechanics in this, like in 5th edition, or in Pathfinder, their bloodline spellcasting is mentioned in their flavor text. In this edition, sorcerers and bards both use charisma for their spellcasting, and also to gain extra spells. However, in this edition, paladins use wisdom. There isn't too much information we can get from 4th edition, since it's the black sheep of D&D. However, it's still very interesting to have a look at. This is the edition where Warlock is introduced. However, spells are weird in this edition, and it depends on kind of what spell you're casting to what ability score determines it. Finally, at modern 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, this is the first edition where paladins actually need to use their charisma score for spellcasting, although it's always been encouraged for them to have high charisma scores, so this might have been changed to reflect that. Additionally, warlocks, sorcerers and bards all use charisma for their casting. All abilities in this edition are a bit more useful, since instead of there being a reflex, fortitude and will saving throw, there's simply a saving throw for each ability score. Finally, it's very important to remember that Charisma is the single most important score for roleplaying, but roleplaying hasn't always been the most encouraged thing to do at your gameplay table. The original Dungeons & Dragons rules were designed to be played as a war game rather than the modern role-playing game we see it as, and up until about 3rd edition, it was mostly viewed as a dungeon crawler, and even in the adventure modules, towns didn't really have characters, it was more of what was in the towns, and the information to push them towards the next big dungeon they needed to conquer. Now obviously this differed from game to game. Some games probably had a higher role-playing emphasis, but in general, back in the 20th century, the game used to have very little prompting for role-playing or really anything that used the charisma ability, whereas in modern D&D, it's difficult to get from point A to point B without talking to a lot of people. Now why is all this history important for there being so many charisma casters? Well, if you look at the game from a balance point, prior to the most recent editions, charisma was a very underused stat, so the game designers probably kept making charisma casters to balance this out. And because of this culture shift towards more role-playing, it just ended up that charisma was an incredibly commonly used skill that's also used by 4 different classes for spellcasting. After all, prior to 3rd edition, charisma's only use was whether you were allowed to play a druid or a paladin and how many friends your character could have. Also, prior to 5th edition, in any given edition, no more than 2 classes were based on charisma, as sorcerers only exist in 3rd and 5th edition, and warlocks only exist in 4th and 5th edition, and in 3rd edition, paladins were wisdom casters, meaning that this monopoly of casters that charisma has is just a coincidence that all these classes happen to be in the same edition. So when I made my first video about charisma casters, I was under the impression that charisma was a skill about how you speak and influence others, and while this is true, it goes quite a bit deeper. 3rd edition's description does it the most justice, stating that charisma measures a character's force of personality, persuasiveness, personal magnetism, ability to lead, and physical attractiveness. This ability represents actual strength of personality, not merely how one is perceived by others in a social setting. To summarize this, charisma isn't the simple estimate of how good you are at speaking, it also describes your leadership skills and the strength of your personality. To go even further than the simple books tell you, a few comments I got in my original video describe this even better. In specifics to why sorcerers use charisma, commenter SP Killen mentioned that charisma is the sheer force of will to draw on your own resolve. Bards use this to deal with the stress of performance under pressure, warlocks use this to deal with the stress of their bargains and pacts, paladins must use this will to adhere to their strict code that they follow, and sorcerers need to use this willpower to release their inner potential while holding back their nature so they don't vaporize themselves in the process. This description of charisma being the sheer force of will to control your self-expression and weaponize it is by far the best and most valid description I've ever seen of charisma. Sure, wisdom may be the ability score that determines your willpower, however in this case, it's more about the willpower and control of your self-expression to keep your nature in check. So to finally bring it back to the original question, now that we have all of this information, why are there so many charisma-based casters in 5th edition? Well, to be honest, the answer's a little unsatisfying. It's a coincidence. 5th edition has nearly every single class that's ever been in Dungeons & Dragons, and to be honest, it has every single class if you take into account that the Illusionist class is just a School of Illusion Wizard subclass, and the Thief class both evolved into the Rogue class and is represented by the Thief subclass, and all other classes from older editions that aren't named in the new editions still exist in some capacity through subclasses. So when all these classes were finally brought into a single edition of Dungeons & Dragons, it just so happened that 4 of them used charisma to cast, but historically, all weren't in the same editions. Additionally, remember that differing between stats for casting was only really a mechanic in 3rd edition as well as in 5th. And perhaps the issue I had isn't really that there's so many casters that use charisma, and more that prior to the Artificer's release, there was only one class that used intelligence to cast, plus also a rogue subclass. Despite what my original video said, all 4 charisma casting classes make perfect sense, and although I'd still like to see a sorcerer that uses Constitution to cast, simply because I like the idea of a tankier mage, I have a newfound appreciation for an understanding of both the sorcerer class and how charisma should be viewed more often in Dungeons & Dragons. So there you have it, a simple answer for the question, but also a lot of history behind it. Going through the rulebooks of older editions might have given me a massive headache at sometimes. I mean, look at this table from 1st edition that just describes if you can hit with your attack. Imagine having to go through this for each attack. But it was also really fun to go through editions I haven't played, like 2nd to 4th, and also nostalgia to go through 3rd edition, which I used to play. I also went through my old Pathfinder books, and although that didn't make into the video, it was still really fun and reminiscent of when I got into this hobby. So if you're interested in more videos about history or changes between editions, let me know in the comments, please. If there's an interest, I'm definitely excited to delve back into these books. Or even just describing some differences between Pathfinder and 3rd edition could also be really fun. Did you know that Pathfinder had the Sorcerer Bloodline mechanics before core D&D did? I didn't. If you like this video, please leave a like or subscribe. It helps me immensely. And if you like this type of video, please let me know. This is a new video format for me and I'm still figuring out what I like to make on this platform. Thank you so much for watching this.